If you remember the bank failures in 2023, those would be your Silicon Valley Bank. Those would be your Signature Bank. Those would be your First Republic Bank. Now, if you remember in the Silicon Valley Bank, a bank that had rapid growth, but the problem with them is they had a lot of uninsured deposits. They had a lot of deposits that were, when I talk about uninsured deposits, I'm talking about deposits that are over the $250,000 threshold that the FDIC insures. So they had too many uninsured deposits with that amount, though they had rapid growth. Now, also, that led to liquidity issues. Which again, I told you is kind of the maturation of that when you have those big, huge interest rate hikes. Then you have your particular securities or long-term securities that go through their devaluation, which is a problem. Then you have your places like your Silicon Valley Bank that has a lot of uninsured deposits of over $250,000. But then you have slowed up liquidity, which then it starts the people, the customers of the bank, the people that have their accounts there, they do a run on the bank because they get scared of what's going on there. Like, what in the world is happening here? Why is there a devaluation in our long-term securities? Why is there dried up liquidity? Then it causes them to be scared, and now you have a run on the bank. Then the next thing you know, your Silicon Valley Bank that has such rapid growth is now insolvent. Same similar thing happened to Signature Bank. You had a lot of uninsured deposits that were over $250,000 that were uninsured. You had dried up or slow liquidity. And so what happens? You have a run on the bank. Then the next thing you know, the bank is insolvent. Same thing with First Republic Bank. These are things that leads to a domino effect across the industry, which I'll kind of lead to here in a minute. Now, what else happened going forward? From you had 2022, 2023. What happens in 2024? You have the Republic First Bank in Philadelphia, and you have the First National Bank of Lindsay. Both collapse. You have both of those banks become insolvent, and they have to close their doors. 2024, ladies and gentlemen, that was last year. Well, that's only two banks, Bronald. That's really not a big deal. That's two banks, Bron. That's not. What are you making a big deal about two banks for last year? Well, that leads me into my next thing here. When you had those particular banks collapse, you got to look at the overall trajectory of things. Because by early 2025, the FDIC had on their bad list, so to speak, or a list of concerns of institutions to be concerned about. They have a list that they have of people that are being monitored, of being in trouble. On their bad list or on their list of monitoring institutions that are in trouble, In 2025, they had 63 institutions that were on the list because of overall weak and concerning performance. 63. So when they get these types of entities and these types of banks and things on that particular list, then that's a major concern, because these are banks, if they don't get their act together and get in order, that could lead towards being insolvent and lead towards being collapsed if they don't get their affairs in order. You're talking about 63 institutions that were on this list. 63 just this year in 2025. Also, this year in 2025, you had unrealized losses by mid 2025 tied to fluctuations in the 10-year Treasury yield, which approached about 4.5% in fluctuation, to the tune of $500 to $515 billion. Well, why is that important? Well, U.S. Treasuries are not supposed to fluctuate like that. There's supposed to be some stability there. So why are there U.S. Treasury 10-year yields fluctuating like that to the tune of 4.5%, $500 to $515 billion just this year? That is a problem. Those things are not supposed to be unstable like that. Those things are not supposed to be unstable that way. What made the US dollar the world reserve currency? Yes, it was being pegged to gold, but the biggest thing that made it the world reserve currency is its stability. Other currencies wanted to be pegged to the US dollar, or wanted the US dollar in the forefront and do business surrounding the US dollar because of its stability. Enter the 2025 Genius Act. The Genius Act. Well, what is the Genius Act? Well, the Genius Act is what they call the Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for U.S. Stables Coins Act. The Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for U.S. Stablecoins Act. This was signed in July of 2025 by President Trump. Now, the Genius Act prioritizes consumer protection. It's supposed to strengthen the U.S. dollar's reserve currency status, which is the biggest thing above anything, is to maintain that status, and then also bolster our national security. Also, with the U.S. Stablecoins Act, it is said to put the United States in the forefront of innovation and technology, in showing the world the way this should be done as far as taking our financial system into the future. We are the leaders in doing that. We're going to spearhead the whole thing. So, what did I say before? The word that we have to focus on during this whole video and going forward into the future in finance and in our currency is stability. Stability makes us where we are as far as a nation and in being the world reserve currency. Now, the more we print and print and print and print and print, our currency loses its value over time. Now, if there's a way that we can stop that and get ahead of it and stop printing ourselves into oblivion to get ourselves out of trouble, then maybe this thing starts receding some. Hopefully it's not too late. I think this Genius Act is a move in the right direction. And I told you before that these entities and these powerful and wealthy people know well ahead of time, and probably know more than you or I do, that our financial system needed a change. You could no longer do things the way you did them before because it was not working. That's why you have things like the 2008 financial crisis. That's why you have the repo scare of 2019, 2020, where liquidity dries up and your overnight banking operations that's been working for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades all of a sudden stops. And you need an influx of currency from the Fed in order to continue overnight operations because there is no cash. That doesn't just happen for an operation that's been operating like this over decades without any major issues like that. But since the 2008 financial crisis, which I told you we never got out of, then that when you have a global pandemic, then all of a sudden it leads to it's a domino effect. Now all of a sudden you have an issue where you have liquidity dry up and you need a bailout. And as I told you before, I read in some places where it was to the tune of $11 trillion. $11 trillion. Now, I would go ahead and say it's probably more along the line of billions, but still, anytime you have to print that money in order to bail out institutions is never good. There's a devaluation of the currency. Stability is the main issue. The old way of doing finance doesn't work. That's why we're moving into the new decade, moving into the new century, moving into the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. There has to be a new way because the old way is not working. And the reason I know what I'm talking about, why would they start implementing cryptocurrency or stable coins into commercial banking operations? Why would they do that if it wasn't necessary? Because the old way is not working. They need a new way of doing things. And so you have the Genius Act. Next thing that's going to be very important to the whole cryptocurrency industry is going to be the Clarity Act. The Clarity Act will bring clarity to the whole industry in so many different ways. The Genius Act kind of spearheaded and started things, kind of got it going. But the Clarity Act will totally button things up and bring clarity to the whole industry. And it may be more important than the Genius Act. Now, when you have those things come together, and then the government messes around and does a Bitcoin reserve, it is downhill with no brakes at that point. Which leads me to my next thing. And I'll end here. For those of you that have not been able to take advantage of these generational things that have happened over the years, 2008 financial crisis. For those that were alive when the gold standard was stopped and you had the crisis that happened in the 70s, you don't have people that were alive then or adults then to be able to take advantage of those things. But 2008 financial crisis, the vid of 2020, you did have the repo crisis, but it did not destroy the markets too much. But the vid was going on then. So by the vid happening, the vid dropped the market down to a very a very, very low peak. But you could have gotten in and done well if you bought in at that particular discount. And now, what's going on right now with stable coins that have been used, as I showed you, since 2019, going into this year, where now you have a regulatory framework and regulatory clarity in regards to cryptocurrency, blockchain technology, and how it's going to be utilized by our government, by our financial institutional powers, such as the Fed. You get an idea how it's going to be used. And now they're signing legislation into law for it to be used. You have an opportunity. You have an opportunity here that can be life-changing. These type of opportunities only come around once every generation for a lot of these things. This right here, this is a once in a generation thing. I used to tell people about this years ago, and maybe because it was me that was saying it, maybe they didn't incline their ear to listen and act upon it. But as you see here, these administrations aren't playing. This particular administration is not playing. They're they're putting pen to paper and putting legislation in motion. So you would do well to do your due diligence and dig and do your own research yourself. But do not, I repeat, do not miss out on these opportunities. Some of these opportunities only come around once in a generation. And this rewiring of the system that is happening to our financial system only comes around once in a generation. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for all your time. And remember, always, always, always stay vigilant. Thank you.